hurricane season is upon us.
Good. You're stealing my segue title. You're doing very good at
It's
things.
such a tough challenge there. Yeah, it actually begins the 15th of this month for the Pacific and June 1st for the Atlantic. And as we prepare for that, it's always helpful to have some idea of just how active the season is expected to be. So with us now to tell us more is hurricane forecaster Dr. Phil Klotzbach, who's also a senior research scientist for the Department of Atmospheric Science at the Walter Scott Jr. College of Engineering, where he's worked for the past 23 years. Which means he got the job when he was 6. Look at him. He's developed the 2-week forecast issued during the peak months of the hurricane season between August and October. His first forecast for the 2025 season came out in April and will be updated again in early June. Phil Klotzbach, welcome to Hello Houston. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate the time, taking the time to talk with me.
All right, let's get to it. So let's remind everyone, Phil, first of all, what's considered an average season?
Yeah, so an average Atlantic hurricane season has a total of 14 named storms. So those are systems named by the National Hurricane Center, so tropical storms and hurricanes. Of those 14, 7 becoming hurricanes, and of those 7, 3 becoming major Category 3, 4, 5 hurricanes. Those are hurricanes with winds of 111 miles per hour or greater. Right now, the average is based on data from 1991 to 2020. NOAA basically every 10 years will update that climatology. So starting in 2031, our average will be based on a 2001 to 2030 climatology.
Well, I like that you make the point. It's not a cumulative number. It's 14. Of those 14, 7 can become hurricanes on average, and of those 7, 3 become major. So I was around when Dr. Gray first, I started in 1982. I remember when Dr. Gray started in 1984 making these forecasts, and we were all like, really? Somebody's going to try to forecast how many hurricanes we're going to have? That is absolutely crazy. But he did a pretty good job of getting it right. And I always kind of went, if Dr. Gray says it's going to be busy, it's going to be busy. And if he says it's not going to be busy, then it probably isn't. So that has been fine-tuned now that you guys have a pretty good track record. What is your accuracy rate now?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Dr. Gray, actually, my mentor at Colorado State, started these forecasts all the way back in 1984. And so we've obviously tuned the methodology over the years, taking into account just better data that we have now than he had in 1984. But overall, I would say for the April forecast, it's about plus or minus 3 hurricanes. When you get to June, into the updates in June and August, it's more like plus or minus 2. We have actually also shown improved skill in recent years. Just we have a lot better technology than we did, say, 40 years ago. So kind of like, your day-to-day weather models are a lot better than they were 20, 30 years ago. Our seasonal forecasts are also getting better, both due to better historical data, which was basically how we develop our models, as well as better forecasts of things like El Nino, Atlantic water temperatures, Atlantic shears, the critical factors that drive above or below normal hurricane seasons.
Yeah, we barely had models 40 years ago. I mean, it was hard to find much more than a weather balloon back then. So what do you look for? And keep it fairly simple in terms of water and temperature and pressure. But what parameters are most important for your forecast?
Yeah, so we look at a wide variety of factors, really, especially, the February, March, April timeframe that we're in, and now we're into May. We look at kind of conditions all around the globe. And then as we get more towards July and August, we really tend to focus a lot more just on the tropical Atlantic. And the reason why we go a little farther afield this time of year is just due to the fact that basically we have what we call teleconnection. So basically, when you warm temperatures one place or the temperatures drop one place, it can then change how the atmosphere responds. 2 of the big factors that we look at are El Nino, La Nina. So basically, El Nino is warmer than normal waters in the central and eastern tropical Pacific. La Nina is colder than normal waters in the same region. And why that's important is because of what it does to levels of vertical wind shear, which is a change in wind speed and direction with height in the atmosphere. Too much shear tears apart hurricanes. When you get an El Nino, again, that warmer water in the eastern and central tropical Pacific, it tends to shift where the thunderstorms form in the Pacific Ocean in such a way that the winds high up in the atmosphere blow stronger out of the west into the Caribbean, into the tropical Atlantic. That tends to increase those shearing winds that tear apart hurricanes. They mix in dry air and really tends to squelch the storms. So in general, El Nino is good for us, bad for the hurricanes. La Nina is bad for us, good for the hurricanes. So that's one of the big factors that we look at. Another big factor that we look at every year is how are the Atlantic water temperatures? When they're warmer than normal, that provides more fuel for storms. It also tends to lower the pressure and also tends to relate to lower levels of vertical wind shear. And so, one of the important things with our seasonal forecast is we don't look at these predictors we look at them individually, but then it's also important to consider them in combination. And one of the big reasons why that really kind of came to the forefront was if you look back in 2023. So 2023, we had a strong El Nino, and the prevailing wisdom is a strong El Nino kind of dominates over everything else. However, in 2023, we had a strong El Nino, but also a record warm Atlantic. So the big question was, which would quote unquote win between these two kind of forces that normally pull hurricane season one way or the other. And actually the warm Atlantic won. We had a very busy season with a total of 20 storms. So it's important to kind of take these predictors. We look at them individually, but then also consider them in combination.
So, Dr. Klotzbach, even though June 1st officially kicks off the season, we've seen something develop in May almost every year in the past decade, it seems like. Why is that?
Yeah, so we have seen storms forming prior to the start of the hurricane season. Oddly enough, last year with the warmest Atlantic on record at the end of May, we actually didn't have any storms form until Alberto in about the middle of June, although we did have the earliest Category 5 hurricane on record last year with Hurricane Beryl. But yeah, we have had quite a few storms forming prior to the 1st of June or in 2022 and 2023. We had a storm form right after the 1st of June. And so some of that may be to the fact that basically the Western Atlantic is somewhat warmer than it was, say, 20, 30 years ago. So these storms can form just because overall the environment is a little more conducive. Now, it's important to realize, though, that while we have had some of these weak storms form prior to June 1st, we haven't actually had a full-blown hurricane prior to the first of, or during the month of May since 1970. So we have seen some storms prior to the 1st of June, but these tend to be fairly weak. However, just because they're weak doesn't mean they still can't cause problems. More obviously, given they're not super strong for winds, more of a rain issue than a wind issue.
You were talking about the range of years to help predict, and you talked about what we're looking at now goes up through, I think you said 2020, and then 10 years we'll look at the period of time here. What I'm interested in that, what we feel like we've seen, and you actually have the data that supports or doesn't what I'm about to say, in the last few years, the last 5 years or so, it seems like weather patterns have changed. The severity of what we're seeing has intensified. If that is true, then looking at what happened up through 2020, is that still reliable to help you predict what's happening in 26, 27, 28? Or is there a change happening out there right now?
Well, and so that 30-year climatology is basically just what they use for kind of a long-term averages. Obviously, we look at things up through obviously what happened in the past hurricane season. And obviously, we look at what we had last year in 2024 was a hyperactive season, but an extremely unusual season in that we had earliest Category 5 on record with Beryl. Then we went to kind of when the season normally really ramps up in middle of August and had very little activity through the middle part of September, and then ended with one of the busiest seasons on record. So, it just kind of highlights that every individual year is different. And I think especially, with weather patterns changing, it is important to also, we also use a lot of forecast models. So not just looking at, we use the past, but we also look at forecast models, forecasting, say, the next 3 to 6 months for large scale weather patterns like shears and water temperatures to try to kind of get at, especially when we have these situations that we hadn't seen historically. For example, again, back to 2023, where you had a strong El Nino, record warm Atlantic. The question was kind of what would win. And we looked a lot at climate model forecasts, and they forecast record warm Atlantic, strong El Nino, and lower than normal shear. And we said, okay, they should kind of be able to figure out where air is going up and air is going down and how the shear pattern is going to respond. And by doing that, we ended up with a pretty successful forecast in 2023. I think had 2023 occurred, say, 20 years earlier, I think it would have probably been significantly under forecast, just given, again, the prevailing wisdom up to that point was that a strong El Nino would dominate. However, we just hadn't seen a strong El Nino with just as warm an Atlantic as we saw that year.
So staying with that question just for a second more, is this current period we're in, this what we feel is more erratic and unexpected and intense, is that something unique and different happening right now, or cyclically and statistically something that does happen and that this is not out of the ordinary?
Yeah, so I mean that gets to be kind of a hard question. It probably depends on who you ask. You probably, if you put on 10 of my colleagues, you probably get 10 different answers. We have been in a string of generally busy hurricane seasons. So since 2015, which was below normal, 2016 to 2024, 8 of those 9 years met NOAA's definition of either an above normal season or a hyperactive season. The only one that wasn't hyper or above normal was 2022, which still produced obviously Hurricane Ian, so obviously still an extremely damaging season. Some of this is due to the fact just that the Atlantic is warmer. That provides more fuel for the storms. But we've also been looking at a longer term trend towards La Nina. So not to say we haven't had El Ninos, we had a strong El Nino back in 2023, but overall, the tropical environment is trending more towards La Nina, and La Nina tends to favor Atlantic hurricanes, but also at the same time disfavor Pacific hurricanes and typhoons. So if we look, say, globally, and we look at the number of, say, hurricane events globally, that number has actually trended significantly downward over the last 35 years. The Atlantic tends to go somewhat opposite of the rest of the globe.
All right, we're talking to Dr. Phil Klotzbach of Colorado State University about his hurricane forecast, which we are now going to get to. So Phil, we talked about the average season being 14, 7, and 3. Last year, it was 18, 11, and 5. 18 storms turned into 11 hurricanes, 5 became major. So where is your forecast this year, and what are you basing it on?
Yeah, so we put out our first forecast on April 3rd. At that point, we did call for an above normal hurricane season. Not as much activity as what we saw last year. We're calling for a total of 17 named storms. Of those 17, 9 becoming hurricanes. And of those 9, 4 becoming major hurricanes. Two primary factors. One, we do not anticipate El Nino this summer and fall. We did have a weak La Nina this past winter into this early spring. A few weeks ago, NOAA declared that La Nina was over. We're currently in what we call neutral conditions, which means neither El Nino nor La Nina. But we do think that the odds of El Nino are relatively low, especially given the forecast winds coming up across the central tropical Pacific look to be fairly strong. When those winds are strong, that promotes evaporation off of the ocean surface, and kind of like if you get out of a swimming pool on a windy day, you get cold in a hurry because you get a lot of evaporational cooling. The same works, off of the ocean surface. So we do think that the odds of El Nino are fairly low. In the Atlantic, thankfully, the Atlantic is quite a bit cooler than it was last year at this time. Obviously, that's good news, but we still have broadly a little bit warmer than normal, especially in the Caribbean and also in the subtropical Eastern Atlantic. And that actually matters this time of year because it then tends to force a weaker, basically lower pressures in the subtropics, which weakens kind of effectively the winds blowing across the tropical Atlantic. And if you have weaker winds blowing across the ocean, that tends to lead to the Atlantic to warm up relatively quickly. So we've actually seen those winds fairly weak the last 10 days to about 2 weeks, and we've seen the Atlantic go from actually a little bit below normal if you average across the main development region or the main region where hurricanes develop to a little bit above normal. So we're going to obviously be watching all this very closely as we get ready for our next update, which will come out on the 11th of June.
We will look forward to that. So let me ask you about Saharan dust. We get a lot of that here in Houston and a lot of it obviously across the Atlantic. It's important for a lot of ecosystems. It helps suppress hurricanes just because it's hard to get a lot of thunderstorms when you have a lot of dust out there. And it obviously cools the Atlantic a little bit also. So given that, it seems to be a player in tropical development, especially June and July. But it's very hard to predict. And in fact, I don't think we really can predict it.
Yeah, so Saharan dust is kind of a tricky, it's a tricky one to handle. And I think last year's a really good example of kind of where, so normally in June and July, as you mentioned, you get a lot of dust that comes off the Sahara and off of what we call the Sahel, which is basically the region between kind of the equatorial region, which is very moist, and there's kind of this sub-arid region. And during the summer, what you end up with is you get basically these easterly waves or strong thunderstorm complexes that come off the coast of Africa. Those can also bring dust off with them, and often the strongest waves will bring off a lot of dust. So it can be a little bit tricky to kind of suss out, when you have dust, yes, that will suppress storm activity, but you can get really robust dust outbreaks after strong easterly waves or thunderstorm complexes. And obviously, if you're looking for a lot of hurricanes, you want those complexes being strong. So it is a little bit tricky. So normally what we found is that in general, you tend to, the dust in the Eastern Atlantic doesn't necessarily correlate super well with overall hurricane activity in a particular year. But if the dust goes farther to the west, more towards the Caribbean, that's where the area that tends to have higher correlations. And that likely means if you have a lot of dust making it that far west, you tend to have fairly strong winds blowing out of the east at lower levels, which means you have more shear. As you mentioned, also, obviously, dust, you just suppresses strong thunderstorms. Now, last year was kind of an interesting example. So last year, June and July, we had the earliest Category 5 on record. The shears were low. The waters were really warm. So we thought everything was pretty much a go for, a slam dunk, really, really busy hurricane season. Yeah, but we also had a lot of dust, which kind of went opposite of the normal relationships. Normally when you have a low shear and warm waters, you have less of that dust. And we do think that dust may have played a bit of a role in why during the middle to later part of August, the systems coming off Africa came off very far to the north. So normally they come off maybe 15, 16 degrees north. They came off more like 20 degrees north. And that matters because if the systems come off that far north, they come off over cooler water and a more stable atmosphere, and they just basically didn't have much of a chance of forming. If, for example, you look late August of last year, the shears were extremely low, the waters were really warm, and the National Hurricane Center, their tropical analysis and forecast branch, is only tracking one very kind of weak, anemic system across the entire Atlantic. Normally you'd be tracking 3, 4, maybe even 5. So just there were really no candidates for a formation. So the dust tropical cyclone relationship is messy. And I think that's something we're going to be diving into and looking into a lot more detail. We did actually just also submit a research paper on the big lull that we had during the kind of normal peak of the hurricane season last year.
A quick question here, and if you addressed it, I apologize. You're good at predicting if we're going to have these storms. How good are you at predicting the path of them? We see when we're even watching forecasting leading right up to it, there's still a million lines on this page. How early on can you be confident in the path they're taking?
Yeah, so really the answer is not much. We can't say a lot with where the storms are going to track. And that's because, with seasonal hurricane prediction, one of the reasons Dr. Gray got into this business is because the tropics have a lot of persistence. So basically in the tropics, if the pressures are low today, they're likely to be low tomorrow. Like there just is a lot of basically, persistence from day to day. Whereas in the middle latitudes, me being in Colorado, I can tell you right now it's 42 degrees in my house and pouring rain. 48 hours ago, it was 83. There's a lot of changes day to day. And so that mid-latitude weather is critical for exactly where these storms are going to track. I think really when it comes to seasonal forecasting and, seasonal forecasting and landfalls and impacts, more we can maybe do is get at maybe where storms are more likely to form. So for example, if a storm forms right off the coast of Africa, the odds of that hitting the US are actually fairly low. Not that they can't, but in general, they're going to track a little bit north of due west and are a little bit more likely to recurve. Whereas if something, say, forms near the Lesser Antilles or in the Caribbean, it's likely to cause significant impacts for somebody just because, it's in a region where kind of no matter which vector it takes, it's going to end up hitting somebody. So I think really trying to get more at maybe where storms are more likely to form is probably what we're going to be able to do better than forecasting where storms are going to track. That's governed a lot more by these day-to-day weather patterns that don't have a lot of predictability more than, a couple of weeks out. I would say with our seasonal forecast, there's not a lot we can say. We also do 2-week forecasts during the peak months of the season from August through October. With those forecasts, I think then we can start to kind of highlight, we can get more confidence as to potentially where storms may form, and then potentially also look a little more at how they may track. Also, I do want to point out the NOAA's Climate Prediction Center does forecast globally for week 2 and week 3 where storms may form as well.
And as we know, Phil, it only takes one.
That's right.
That will ruin your day. Thanks so much for joining us.
Dr. Phil Klotzbach is a hurricane forecaster and a senior research scientist for the Department of Atmospheric Science.